So this class, I guess the title is Introduction to Names, and the description of it was pretty good. In my mind, maybe the title for this class is, hey, I want to register my name. This class is intended as an introduction for people who are either heralds, maybe more by necessity than by choice, or getting interested in heraldry. But if you're just interested in registering your own name and that's your primary purpose for being here, this class will give you a pretty good start on that. It may give you enough information that you could help other people. And I'm going to warn you about that now so you can back out before it's too late in the event that this might be some kind of unfortunate lead-in to becoming a herald. So a little bit about, I'll just introduce myself. Normally I go by Fairfax. That's actually going to come up, even though my SCA name is Alan Fairfax. That's an example of what happens if you don't get good information early on in the process of coming up with a name. My excuse is that I joined the SCA in 1987 on the edge of the known world in a Dungeons and Dragons shop in Davison, Michigan. It's no longer the edge of the known world, but it was back. There was no group north of us at that time. I mean, unless you're like in Alaska or something like that. I was not old enough to fight. There was no youth combat, and I liked reading stuff. So I very rapidly got, and I liked being loud. And so bringing those two things together, I ended up as a herald pretty quick. Like within 3 weeks, I was reading the basic heraldry books and doing that stuff. And I mostly did heraldry for, I don't know, like 13 years, I guess. Started the Academy of St. Gabriel along the way, which is one of the resources we'll be talking about. And then got told by my pelican that I was really an A&S person and I needed to go be an A&S person. So I did that, and I stopped doing heraldry for a long time, like almost 10 years of almost nothing. And then kind of, I guess more like 15, then kind of came back into it. That whole A&S versus service thing is going to come up down the road, but I've done a lot of consulting, both in names and armory. I've worked at Herald's Point at least 15 different years at Penzic. I've been a regional herald, a herald at large, done lots of stuff. And one of the things we're going to talk about is a little bit of the philosophy behind what someone's trying to get when they're trying to get a name, which might be a little different than your typical class. So before I take any questions, I'll get into the purpose. So this is the first of a series of 4 classes. We're trying this out. My current job, I'm the Buckler Herald. Oh, let's see. Maybe something could be done about the shaking. Like I can set the, let's see. Is that better? A little bit? Looks better, okay. I'm gonna have to move my mouse, and when I move that, it will maybe shake a little bit, but it should be a lot more stable. This is the first in a series of 4 classes, which is designed to provide an introduction to the basics of what you need to know to get started as a herald. So this class is on name consulting. They're going to be every Sunday at 7 for the next 4 weeks. So the second class is device heraldic design. Class number 3 is voice heraldry, and the 4th class is an introduction to conflict checking. So every Sunday at 7, we're going to have one of these. Today, as I mentioned, the purpose of this class is to go through the process of getting a registrable name, something that you can send in through the heraldic submission process and have pass. When you come to approach that, there are 3 questions that are always worth asking before you get into looking up the name or doing more research. Yes?
Oh, I'm sorry. Nothing.
Oh, no big deal. I have to remember to lean back so I'm not. Okay. So so the first of the 3 questions is, should the name get registered at all? And this might sound like a strange question, but the fact is nobody has to register their name in the SCA, at least not in the MidRealm. I know I've heard rumors that there are some kingdoms where there are certain things you can't do until your name is registered. For the most part, there's no obligation to register your name for any reason. What does registering a name mean? Well, the first thing means there's a big book of names. And if you register your name, you're in the big book of names. And that's kind of cool, right? So that's the motivating factor. Second, if you want to register a coat of arms, you need to have a registered name. So in order to, even if you don't particularly care about your name for whatever reason, but you have armory that you want to use, it may be necessary to register your name so you can register arms. Third, if you have a registered name, any awards you get are probably going to be under that. Usually there's some attempt to check what name a person actually has. Andreas could talk about this, you know, having done a lot of work with the order of precedence in our kingdom. You can find you may find that if you don't register a name, people aren't sure what to call you. If you do register a name, that's what people will call you, even if it's not what the name you normally go by. I guess the main reason people register names, in my experience, it's something you're just kind of supposed to do. It's part of, I don't know, being a respectable grown-up person in the SCA. A lot of people, you know, come to me at Herald's Point, or when I've been a branch herald, and said, yeah, I've been in the SCA for a while, and I just think it's time that I'm supposed to register a name. So people just feel like it's something they're supposed to do, and that's okay, but it's maybe not always the most useful thing for them. And we're going to get to that in the next couple questions. The second question you need to ask, and let me ask, I can see there's still a bit of shaking. Do I need to try moving again, or is this stable enough? Okay. The second question you need to ask is, what do you know about the name you want? This is really important, and we're going to come back to it in a little bit, because it determines whether you are looking for a particular name or a particular culture or a meaning. This can take you in a variety of different directions. Sometimes people come, I'm going to move back a little bit to get out of the sun. Sometimes people show up and they say, I want to be Wolfgar. And do they care about the century that Wolfgar is? Do they care about the culture? Not in the slightest. If you can look up Wolfgar and find it anywhere, they're happy. Sometimes people have something they want. I knew a guy who came in who said, I want to be Bastard Son. I'm like, why do you want to be Bastard Son? And he said, because my father is so-and-so the bastard. And so, and I'm like, and he says, and he has a name, but everybody calls him Bastard. So I figured they'd call me Bastard Son. I'm like, hey, they probably would. So that's where we worked from. Sometimes people come in with a culture where they say, you know, I know that I want to be English, or I want to be Old English, or sometimes super specific, like I want to be from Venice in 1360. You know, all sorts of things like that. Sometimes people have a meaning. So the place to start for kind of understanding what direction to go in is to start by asking, how much do I have that I know about the name I want? The third question you have to ask is one that I love asking, because the looks on people's faces, both around me and in front of me, is always kind of priceless. But I think it's important, and this is maybe not something that everybody would tell you to do, but I'm going to say this is vital. Question number 3 is, do you care if it's medieval or not? Now you might stop and say, well, what do you mean do you care if it isn't the point to get a medieval name? For a lot of people, no. A lot of people come in and they have a name that they're using, and that's what they want. And If you know that going in, then you can work to get them what they want. If someone comes in and says, yes, I care, then you go in a different direction. Because the classic example would be, in Irish and Scottish. In Scotland, this comes up all the time because Scotland has 3 or 4 different languages, all of which change greatly over some time period, right? So someone can come in and say, I want this Scottish name, and maybe you can find it for them, but then they say, I want to be an early period Highlander, and you tell them, well, that name is not early period, nor will anybody in the Highlands ever use it. Some English noblemen might use it, not the guy, the persona you say you want, and then they're going to either say, well, I got to throw that out and get a new name, or I don't care, I'm going to call myself William and wear my kilt, and I'm going to be happy about it. The key is, and this is important, talking about why I ended up getting turned into an A&S person, or why I was all along. If you're a herald working as a branch herald or a consulting herald, it's a service. Service means you're working for the benefit of the person, of someone else. So if someone comes to you with a name that's basically not period, which is kind of stupid, that's not really, that's not their problem. If you can help them get it registered, my take on it is, at least that's your job. If you're being a herald and you're helping people, then that means you help people. Maybe if you're at large or something, you can say, go talk to somebody else, I guess. But to me, the service part of heraldry means you're trying to figure out what you can do to get a name registered. And we're going to come back to why it's not that hard to get a name that's probably not very medieval registered in a lot of cases. If someone really wants a name in a particular period, then at some point you're going to say, well, this seems to be right for somewhere, but maybe it doesn't quite fit into this period. You want to be careful about that, because we only have a tiny sample of the names that existed. So if you're starting out and you're not really an expert and you find something, it probably makes sense to say, as far as I can tell, this name is, doesn't fit the time period you want, but it is registrable. When a name is submitted, you can put down pretty clearly, change it for this. And one of the great things about email, like for example, in the MidRealm, if somebody submits a name and they say, I want a 14th century name, and it gets sent up, and then when the word comes back, it's a really good 16th century name, but it doesn't fit the 14th century. Now, the people, the Rouge Scarpe, the herald who's in charge of submissions, can get in touch with that person and say, do you want us to tweak your name or not? Back in the day, it was all on paper, and it could take months for these things to go back and forth, but now it's pretty straightforward. So, if you're in a situation where you're not sure, it's probably better to submit it, but put detailed instructions about what the submitter is looking for. The reason that it's possible to get names that aren't period is because the SCA rules don't want to ban things that might possibly be done. I mean, if you think about it, if there are, millions of people living in, say, England in the Middle Ages, even at like the end, late period England, if 1 out of 100,000 people did something, most people would never ever meet someone who had a certain name or a certain way of being. You find dozens of examples in the book, in the records that we have. And so when you're in that situation, you can't really set a quota and say, well, only the first 3 people who do this can have it because it exists, but it was rare. And so the result is there are ways of putting names together, not so much the names themselves, but the ways of putting names together that can be vanishingly rare in the, or very rare in the Middle Ages, that can be very commonly used. I think the classic example for this is this one, just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. In the late Middle Ages, or in the 16th century, the very end, the Renaissance in England, every so often you'll find an example of someone where the last name of one of their relatives, often somebody in their mother's family, gets used as their first name. We have names around that do this now, like Gordon, Leslie, Evelyn, all started as last names. Howard, all were last names that got turned into first names. And so you find a few cases of this even in before 1600 in the Renaissance. So that means if you find a last name, you can pass it as a first name in English. Well, this means this opens the door to basically every romance novel name there is. You can have Ashtons, you can have Baileys, all these different. Ashton to me is a classic one. It means that almost every trendy name that's hot in the baby name books, Mason, there we go. Any of these trendy modern baby names that people are solely interested in because they're popular in the 21st century, you can register them as late period English names. I don't know of anyone named Mason or Ashton or Bailey in the actual, or Madison. We know for a fact, Madison didn't even exist in the 20th century, much less recently. There was nobody named Madison in the English Renaissance. But because we have this structure, it is at least theoretically possible that we could have had one. And given that, we're not going to say that you can't have any. And this is where the question of do you care if it's medieval comes in. Because if somebody comes in and they just really, really want to be Ashton and they don't care, okay. But if they're like, I want to have a good English Renaissance name and I really like Ashton, then you might have a talk with them about looking through the name lists. Do we have any questions so far? Or are we doing good? Okay. So now we started to get in questions of what do we do next? How do we figure out how to register a name? So I'm going to start with the person who says, yes, I care. Both because that's more fun and because it's often more work. If the person cares and has a particular period, then the first step is to figure out where you are. So this person says, I want to be Polish, or I want to be German, or I want to be Italian. We'll get to this a little bit later. If they say, my persona was born in Venice in 1340, then things can get a little trickier. Because do we know, how do you find names that were used specifically in Venice in 1340? That might be challenging. That's challenging. We'll leave it at that. So then you look to see how close you can get with the resources you have. I'm going to talk about resources in a minute. The second thing you want to know is whether you're looking for a specific name or a pattern. So let's start with names. I'm going to come back to patterns in a minute. So one of the great things about the internet is that we now have the ability to look for lots and lots of names. This actually works pretty well, even if the person doesn't care. I'm going to try sharing my, can I share my screen as not the host? Yes, I can. Okay, so hang on a second here and let me bring up the right window. And there's stuff in the chat. Oh, shaking worse. Okay, hang on a second, my lord. I'm gonna try this. It won't matter a minute because I'll have to share my screen. I'll fix it while I'm sharing and then you won't have to see it. So there are a number of places you can go that have a long list of names that are available and clearly documented. Okay, got my screen up. Okay, no more shaking for a minute. I'll get resettled while we're waiting. So there are several sites. I'm going to put these. This is why I was asking about chat. I'm going to put these in the chat and then in the notes. There are several sites on the internet that are really useful for looking at names. The first one, I'll pick the official, the SCA Heraldry names site. So this is heraldry.sca.org, and it has lots and lots and lots of articles about names in different parts of the world. Written, you'll notice by, there's about a thing in here. A similar list is the Medieval Names Archive, which is sgabriel.org, s-gabriel.org, which has a whole breakdown here. So it's a bigger list of names related to the Middle Ages, medieval names articles. And one of the fun sites, which is put together by Arianwe, or Cotmill, is the Dictionary of Medieval Names from European Sources. This is the best thing ever. It's literally just an alphabetical list of names that have been documented. So if somebody has no idea what they want, you could just start them here. The thing about this is a tiny fraction of the names that actually exist. But yeah, it's just any of these names, you click on it, Senehilda. Oh, there it is, found in 1135. And she's even put the citation here, so you can document it if you want to put it on your documentation. But here's the cool thing. Somebody throw out a name. Maybe put it in chat or shout it out, whatever. I gotta get back to the chat for a second. Oh, I apparently can't see chat and screen share at the same time. Oh, there we go. Thank you. Okay, there we go. Shahzada. So we do this. We go to use Google for this, believe it or not. Who knew that you would use Google to search for things? And you use this happy little tool called Cite. Cite. S-Gabriel.org. Shahzada. Let's see what we find. Oh, it didn't match anything. So let's try. Okay, so you gave us a tough one. Often, trying to think of something, we'll pick an easy one, kind of a basic name. And you have, names for Muscovite charters. And there's Dmitri, frequently used. That actually gets here. Oh, you also have, some dude named Dmitri writing articles. And so, yeah, so you can use these sources to start to search for names. If the person is on the I don't care list, you're actually done now. You've documented their name, congratulations. If they do care, then you can start to give some more details, like this is a name from the 15th or 16th century. Of course, if you go for Dmitri, you're going to find it all over the place. But maybe we're looking for something. Maybe you met someone who came in and really wanted to be a crap. Now you can document that. That's going to show up in an April Fool's letter, I think. Or Nikita, again, we probably know there's a Nikita out there. So this, just searching the whole site, these sites can be a really straightforward way to get through the most, the fastest way to get through the easiest to find names that are out there. That'll actually get you a surprising amount. Most people are, if somebody comes in, they want a specific name, it's a name they've probably heard of, unless they're doing something really, really cutting edge and impressive, like Persian, for example, there's a good chance that they're going to find what they're looking for. So that's, get out of the sun here for you. So that's the starting point for most of the name searching, a lot of the name searching you're going to do. We're going to talk about by names now. So let me stop sharing. So you can look at my beautiful, beautiful face again. There, and I'm not shaking, I hope. So, oh, don't be sorry, because that's gonna, I see the apology for putting a difficult one in. Don't be sorry, because this is gonna happen to you. And one of the challenges is, if you're, when somebody comes to you with a name that you can't easily find, where do you go next? So one principle of registering names is that a name has to have two pieces to it. You have to have a given name and what they call a by name. I'm gonna drink for a second. And I'm sure I'm guessing at least that the difference is pretty clear. The given name is the name that provides you with your, the name you're given at birth, usually. And then by names are anything that comes along later. The key difference between a by name and a surname is that a surname is something that's permanent and usually understood to be hereditary. So a name that you have that your whole family shares that your kids are going to get, that's a surname. Someday they'll talk about the fact that we started this new thing of changing surnames and hyphenating and all that. That's actually a pretty big shift in the way we do names. But the basic idea is still, you have a name and you pass it on to your kids in one form or another. A by name means a name that you get tagged with in one way or another. It may be permanent, it may not be permanent, it just depends. And this is where knowing something about your culture and where you're starting makes a big difference. I'm sorry about I know there's a little shaking there. I share my screen again, because one of the things you have to figure out is, how does a name get put together? So, for example, if you're English until late period, you're normally going to have a given name that's given to you at birth and some kind of by name. And there are a lot of different kinds of by names. I'm going to go down to the English thing here and kind of show you what we're talking about. Sorry, I'm still getting used to it. I use Zoom like almost literally every day, and I still have to remember how to share my screen every single time. And you're going to get the Zoom window that I clicked on, because that's not what you need to share on. And there we go. Okay, can you guys see that, or do I need to zoom in a little bit? Okay. Unfortunately, as you can see, my zooming doesn't actually make it bigger. Oh, here it is. There we go. There we go. Okay. So this shows you, and this document is a PDF on the Herald, the SCA Heraldry website. It shows you some basic information about how names are put together. So basically, this says Middle Early Modern English. Could you have two given names? Well, in late period. Double given names means what we call the middle name. So nowadays, almost everybody gets a double given name, but nobody uses them, or very few people use them. But that's a thing. But it didn't start until late period. These are different kinds of names you can have put together. Locative means a name that says where you're from, right? So if and has all these different forms. Maybe so you could be, let's say you want to be Anna, you could be Anna de London, you could be Anna of London. Maybe, I don't think you'd be at London, that's a whole other, this is a very short thing, but it tells you at least that you can have a name in which the place you come from is mentioned. Patronymic is a name that points back to your father. In most European cultures, I'm not going to say all, almost all names refer to the father rather than to the mother. There are some places and this is one of those cases where something that was done rarely is something that you could do all the time. I know in English, there are some examples of people named after their mothers, and you could use those to build a name where you were your mother's, child. And here it just says marked genitive alone. Marked means that there's a way in which it's identified that you're talking about, that you're identifying yourself as a son or daughter. So the obvious one would be Johnson, right? Johnson means you're John's son. Genitive alone, the genitive is the possessive, so John's is okay, right? Unmarked is just plain John. So what this is telling you is any of those forms are reasonable ways to construct an English name. Other kinds of relationship, matronymic, many others. So you have to do some research. Descriptive or occupational here is what do you do? Is it a name that describes what you do for a living, like baker, miller, clerk? And this is an interesting note. In Old English, rare. In Middle, Early English, yes, all over the place. Dictus is Latin for is called. So that's a way of marking a nickname. Like their name is John the Smith, but everybody calls them something. And so it's a way of marking that. And then you see double by names and the order. Now for English, that's pretty straightforward. That's why I started there. Where it becomes handy is if you're dealing with something like, Lithuanian. Somebody wants a Lithuanian name. And it tells you double given names show up in the 14th century and after, which is actually pretty early. If you have a patronymic, it's the name and then the father's name and then sunus. And then how do you put it together? It's right there. I'm going to minimize that. Given name plus patronymic, given name and an alias and another given name. So these are different ways you could order that. So that gives you a start with a Lithuanian name. It tells you if somebody comes and says, I want to be Lithuanian, if you could find 2 Lithuanian names, you could put them together to make something you could submit. And you can do this even though, I don't know anything about Lithuanian. I know like a couple people who have submitted Lithuanian names, and there you go. Same thing for other languages. I don't even want to touch Gaelic, but there it is. All sorts of information about the different orders of names. Yeah, and so this helps you figure out where to put a name together. The thing that's helpful about this is it gives you a sense of what you're looking for. Patronymic would mean that you're looking for a man's name to use as the basis for your name, your by name. A locative name means that you're looking for a place. So if you find out that in German, locative names exist, that means if you can find a German place that existed in the Middle Ages, you can add it to your name. And that can be your by name. Descriptive and occupational means if you find a medieval German word that means something, you can submit that as a name. And kind of the beauty of this is if you're not sure, it gives you a place to start. Let's say you have someone who comes to you and they say, I'm German and I want to be Hans the Archer, but nobody knows what the word for archer is in German. This gives them a chance. This gives you a place to start to try to find it. One piece of this that's worth mentioning, which is a little bit of a side note, is that in the SCA, you can submit a name that is not not in the language you're submitting in. So I mean by that here is if you are, in the case of Hans the Archer, if somebody says they want to be Hans the Archer, they can actually submit Hans the Archer, because if they want to be German, but they also want people to know what they are, then it's totally acceptable to just say Hans the Archer because the people around them speak English. I looked this up. Technically, if you're in Starleaf Gate, which is in Windsor, Canada, you could submit a name and translate it into French from any language, because French is an officially spoken language in Canada. And so anybody Canadian can submit a name in French. As far as other names go, if you are, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get back to my notes. As far as names that you can't document go, you can also use this to put patterns together. Two really easy examples. Let's say you have somebody come and they say they want to be, they say, I want my name to be Mary of St. Paul, right? Now, if you do a quick search, you're not necessarily going to find an English place named St. Paul, but you will find about 50 English places called St. John, St. Blaise, there's literally dozens. And so that tells you that St. Paul is likely to be reasonable. And you just send in and say that you're basing St. Paul on the following examples that you documented, period. Another one that a lot of people might have run into is in Old English, pretty much everybody's name was composed of two pieces, each of which was an actual word in Old English. And you find that there are some pieces that were used in male names, some that were used in female names, some that were used in both. And so in cases like that, if you find a part 1 for the gender you're looking for and a part 2 for the gender you're looking for, and you put them together, even if you haven't found that particular name, you're going to be able to document it, because there's enough examples to see that the people who spoke Old English put those things together, put part 1 and part 2 together without too much of an obvious concern for meaning or things like that. So it seems it's reasonable that you could put together two names. Another good example would be a saint. In a lot of places, you find that a lot of people are named after saints. And if you can find a person who is recognized as a saint in the area you're in, that's often sufficient documentation, even if it's not in the same period. Probably one of the great examples of that is Francis. Francis, the guy who became known as Saint Francis, his Francis wasn't his name. His name was Francesco, which was a nickname because he was all fancy, and so people called him Frenchie. And then he ended up getting in, he started a religious order, the Franciscans, and it got named after him. So when you say Franciscans, that really means the Frenchies. But those people, after he became famous, across Europe and known as Francis and canonized and recognized as Saint Francis, people all over Europe started naming kids Francis after him, even though that technically wasn't his name. So that's an example where if you find somebody who's known to be a saint in a particular place, you can, that would be an example where you could, use that as documentation. Now, so you talked about name lists. What happens if things get really bad? You're in a really tough situation. Maybe you're looking for Persian and you have to use a book. How do you do that? Well, we're going to go back to a starting point. Okay. And you have a very happy thing, which is, you have two happy things actually, both from the SCA Heraldry website. One is, okay, you got sources that do not require photocopies to Laurel. This is a list of books which are standard references and well enough known that you don't have to worry about copying them. You can just put in a page resource and say, this is what we got. You will notice something pretty quickly. English, English, English. Well, this one is Swedish, Japan, German, English, Anglo-Saxon, Irish, English. Here's a Russian, there we go. Irish. I mean, what we have access to is more English than not. And so it gets trickier when you're trying to document names that are in languages that are not English. But through the list you find, here's a this is Spain, or a couple, Italian. There are books out there, and this gives you, for many cultures, a helpful place to start when you're trying to find name resources. A second and kind of more right direction. This is a list of books that you might run into. Now this goes back to 2000, so this doesn't include newer things, but it does include a lot of resources in a lot of different languages. It doesn't include Persian. We're going to come back to that. I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a great example. To talk about what you need to do if you find books, we're going to talk about a couple things here. So if you need to start looking in books, in addition to that list and the second list, if you have access to those resources, you can use those as a starting place. How many do I need to talk about ILL? I got one no. Okay, so yeah. So briefly, any book you want. Oop, no. Okay, 2 no's. You win. Yeah. ILL anything you want, and it'll get you what you need. I don't know what the rules are on photocopying 100-year-old dictionaries of High German surnames, but that's kind of between you and whoever. But if a book is in the public domain, photocopy it without, just get it. If it's not in the public domain, I'm not going to tell you that you should photocopy the entirety of a copyrighted book, but I'm not going to be looking either. So there you go. If a book's in print, that's another thing. Certainly if it's something that's relatively recent that you can actually buy, buying is a better way to go. But a lot of these books are, academic and haven't been printed for decades. Which gets me to the next source and kind of why I thought it would be fun. Of course, there's Google Scholar, right? And Google, I'm gonna try this first because I don't want to get too off track. See. The problem with Google Scholar and Google Books is that you're having to narrow your search down pretty tightly. So, like for example, when I search for Shahzada, what I get are a whole bunch of books written by people named Shahzada. And then I get books about people named Shahzada who lived in the 20th century, and books about the SS Shahzada. So it starts to get challenging to get to what you're looking for. But it's not a terrible place to go if you can find, if you can find something that is So I was just looking here. When you're looking for something that's harder to find, this isn't a bad place to start. You're going to get into challenges. Here, I'm just looking. I'll show you what you run into. Well, I'll just tell you about it because Shahzada is a title for a, or it's a title that the British used for a Indian ruler, and so there's a lot of hits for the Shahzada of Delhi, which doesn't necessarily help you much at all. But those are good starting points because they tell you that the name is out there in some form, and it's at least worth keeping to look. Do we have any questions at this point? I think this is a good place to pause. Okay, we are rolling right along then. Okay, so far we've mostly covered, we've mostly covered what you need to do to research a name that has some connection to some point in history. And I haven't talked at all, and again, I'm an A&S person first, I guess. I haven't really talked at all about the rules for registration or the things that limit you when you're trying to submit a name other than the historical principles behind it. But there are, go back to our screen share, there is a nice, see what happened to me down. So we have a section, a thing called SCA, stands for the Standards for Evaluation of Names and Armory. I'm going to respond to that for a second. Like, I see that the British didn't invent the title. It's originally Persian. I'm glad to know that. I was only seeing in English sources, and I didn't want to claim that it was an actual Persian title, unless it really was. So thanks for clarifying that. Which means that you guys, the two of you, maybe should talk. So here are the very, very fun and exciting standards for evaluation of names and armory, which are more fun than the last version. Oh, well, there you go. I'm not sure why I didn't find it there. Shahzada, you just did it. Now I'm curious as to why it didn't show up. But I'm gonna show you this for a second because you just did it. This is a perfect example of what to do. Excuse me. So Persian feminine names, and there it is. This is a person who died in 1562. So there you go. As a very little example. Let's talk about this for a second, because this is one of these things that, this is where things get tough when you're dealing with a name in a culture where there's not a lot of documentation in English for. So these are Persian names from the Safavid period, which I could not have told you off the top of my head what that meant. The Safavids conquered Europe, or Iran, in the early 16th century. They spoke Turkish, and so the Turkish language had an elite status. Persian was the ordinary language, and people were still using Arabic. So this says, the following are names of Persian ladies and royal poetesses and royal ladies. Here's the thing that's interesting. This selection of names is by no means a guide to the general naming practices of Persian women. The data pool is very small. Royalty also have naming structures that differ from the name structures of other classes. Finally, since the Safavids were conquerors, their names may not be the best guide. but it says many women have titles which are not strictly part of their names, like sultanum. And I'm guessing you read this. We found several examples of locative bynames based on location, like Samarkandi, Tabrizi, etc. So you went through here, and sure enough, you have Shahzada Sultanum. I guess that's another name for the same person. And you picked Isfahani, because Isfahan is a famous city, and adding an I to it seems to be how you construct the byname. That seems reasonable. Yeah, so that is exactly the kind of steps that you would go through. I will admit I'm curious if Shahzada is a title, if it could possibly have been a title, but since she's got a title here too, seems kind of interesting. I would say the next step for you, and I don't know if you've done this, and you can unmute if you want. Have you looked at the specific person who's mentioned here?
Hi there, if it's okay, I just unmuted.
Yeah, I asked you to.
Oh, okay. Hi, this is Shahzada. What I was able to find was I found one of the books that they were referencing here. The Shahzada was her first name, and then the Sultanum is her title. She was somebody's mother, I believe, and that was her first name.
Okay. Well, that's really cool. Yeah. So, and that's one of the nice things about many of the articles on both the SCA site and St. Gabriel is that they do connect you to books. Do you remember which one you looked at?
If I look at the names real quick, I might be able to find that. I believe it was in the story of somebody's life that I had found that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so that's a great, excuse me, that's a great example of starting here, with, just a search on St. Gabriel and getting to, really solid documentation. So even using books. So back to Sena then. So I wanted to, sorry, I gotta, oh, you know what? Here, I'm gonna stop sharing for a second rather than distracting you. So, okay, so we're back. I'm sure this is gripping. Okay. Here we go. So, I'm not going to expect you guys to go through this in detail, but it's good to know that. Let me rephrase that. I'm not going to expect you guys to go through this in detail in this class in the next 29 minutes. At some point, especially if you're getting significantly into this, it's going to be good to look at. This is written in the style you'd expect. It's very, they try to break it down and make it very, I don't know, it reads almost like a flow chart to me in terms of stepping through the things. And rather than trying to give you every detail, I'm just going to hit on the summary points that are important, some of which we've already covered, which is that you want to have names that come from you need to have two pieces of the name, a given name and a byname. There's several things we talked about that I kind of took for granted when we were talking about names that are, when you're looking for a name that's meant to be registerable for a specific place. Because one of the things that would make sense is if you pick a first name and you pick a byname, a given name and a byname, that you would want to see the whole name fit the same language, right? That's not completely, though, the way it works. One of the things that happened in the Middle Ages is that people, in the Renaissance, is that people moved around. And so you don't always have, there are times when you can see people who have a name in, you know, they start in one country, they have a given name in one language, and they have a byname from a different language. And so the question that comes up is, how do you put those together? And they have actually a chart that goes over this. Let me find it here. Sorry, I should have had this up before we started, but we have, here we are, another handy little chart, which is part of SCA, called my Zoom screen, but regional naming groups and their mixes. So this tells you what you can put with what. In Arabic, if you're 550 to 1100, you can combine Arabic with Greek, Italian, Iberian, Persian. Iberian meaning Spanish, Portuguese, Catalan, those languages, which, you know, from in 550 probably weren't distinguishable from each other yet. English, Welsh, Old English, you can mix with Dutch, French, Gaelic, or Scandinavian languages. So you get the idea. And these are based on research people have done where they found, you know, enough examples of these that it seems reasonable to combine them. And so if someone wants a name, like, you know, the number of people who had Arabic Greek hybrid names is not that high, but there's enough that if, you know, everybody, you know, if hundreds of people in the SCA wanted to do it, that would be, you know, each one could pass. So that gives you an idea. This is another little chart. And again, I'll make sure to send links into the chat. Excuse me. So another principle, when we get to the question of what defines the same time period, you don't necessarily have, one of the languages changed over time. And so it becomes challenging because, of course, when you have very few sources, if someone submits a name that is from, you know, 1200 and another name that's, you know, another name that's from 1600, at what point do you decide how close together the names should be? And the answer, which I should have noted down to make sure, you know, if you're within 200 years, that's going to be, which sounds like a huge, huge amount of time, but part of the problem is we don't have, you know, given the limited amount of documentation we have, it's important to give people a fair amount of leeway in terms of finding the you know, being able to document names in different time periods. And if you think about even now, we're in a little strange situation. So I was trying to make an analogy with, you know, the 21st century, but we've had a remark, since we have been writing down our surnames, you know, consistently for hundreds of years, and, you know, and have records in a way that they didn't. Names change not as fast as they did in the you know, Middle Ages, at least surnames. Where on the other hand, you know, first names we make up all the time. So, so when you get to that I don't care kind of situation, this is what you can look for. You know, it's okay to have names that are from different cultures within some limit and within some amount of distance from each other, even if it's not close. So the other things you need to find, if you're putting together a name that doesn't exist, is a sense of the pattern. And this could be somebody who does care, but a lot of times if people are looking to put something together, these are the kinds of things that you can use to build a name that maybe you can't find a lot of evidence for. We talked about constructing a name. So a classic example would be a name that follows a period person. One example, and this is an example from the rules. In Italian, if you have you have a lot of names where they add INO to make a diminutive. So you could have Augusto, and then you could have Augustino. That's one that you can find documented. Well, there's a name Urbano. Nobody's ever found an Urbanino, but you can make sense that that would fit because it follows that same pattern. We mentioned Old English has the same structure. This is where a lot of the rules about place names and occupations that we talked about earlier come in, because if you can find an occupation or a place, you can use that as a name even if you don't find anyone who's from that place. Finally, there are a couple rules that let you get completely off the path of what's period. There are two that are very significant. One is the legal name allowance. So you can use one element from your legal name in your SCA name, regardless of what it is. If your first name is Hyacinth, then you can register Hyacinth as your given name in any culture, any language, any structure, anywhere you want. And your documentation is your driver's license or whatever. You obviously, they ask you to hide your driver's license number when you send your driver's license in as documentation or when someone does. But that's kind of the point. In the same way, you can use a last name. It's less common that somebody wants to use a last name as part of their SCA name, but it does happen. And so if somebody wants to use their mundane last name as their SCA last name, they can do that without documenting it at all. Similarly, the branch name. You can register any name of any SCA group. One of the fun things about this is it doesn't have to be your SCA group, right? So, if somebody, I think probably one of my, there's like, I lived for several years in the barony of Shadowed Stars. Shadowed Stars is not a name that would pass now in a million billion years. But if somebody wanted to be Albert of Shadowed Stars, they could do that, even though they had never heard of Shadowed Stars and didn't know it existed. Once we register Shadowed Stars, it is good to go. In a rare case, you can have an existing registration allowance. This means that if you've registered a name, and this actually came up with Duke Talimar not that long ago. Duke Talimar's son wanted to register his name. I don't think that Talimar would be registrable today, but because he's Talimar's son, he can be Ap Talimar. And because he's connecting to an actual, you can't see me talking with my hands, that's the worst part about Zoom. Because he's connecting to an actual person who has a registered name, even though that name isn't, even though some random person couldn't register Talimar, he can because he's personally connected to that person. So it's one of the rather, it's one of the the very specific and rare times when is it period doesn't matter, because in a sense, you're not relying on medieval history, you're relying on SCA history, which I guess would be a good reason to register your name, because if your name's not registered, it doesn't get used for that. I had planned to allow some time for questions, and I've gotten very few, but as a result, I've kind of run into the last bit of the material that I had for the class. We do have about 15 more minutes that I signed up to be here for. And do we have, I guess if you have a specific question or, a comment, something that, you found useful, because I know that a number of people on here are actual heralds, we could talk about. Something popped into my head to cover if you don't, but. Okay, the last thing I should talk about, and then we'll still be early, is situations where names can be not registered. Excuse me. Names can be not registered. I want to back up for a second because I made a mistake earlier. When I had said that you could be 200 years apart, it's 500. I had remembered 200 because that's reasonable to me. So to be specific, if you are finding a name, if you find a name where you find two elements from the same language that are within 500 years of each other, you can register them. When you have the list of names that are, like an Arabic-Greek combination, you have to get within 300 years. So some things that some things that would lead you to not register a name. One is obtrusive modernity, sorry. A name that has a modern reference that's very obvious. They actually give examples of some that have been returned. I remember meeting the person who tried to submit the name Porsche Audi, which was returned. Geeky Herald was returned as a title. So is the Artemisian Tank Corps. Every so often you find a name that is, where they say this is just going to make people think of the modern world. It's kind of I don't know if it's a joke but a reference, and it gets bounced for that reason. Conflict. There is such a thing as name conflict. It doesn't come up very often because the standards for name conflict are very, very strict. So if you have a name that has a substantial change to the sound of one syllable. So this means if "de" is changed to "the," if Maria is changed to Marion, if Mary is changed to Marie, you're going to have not a conflict. So the names have to get very close together before you're going to have them conflict with each other. Some of the examples they have is Marjorie Clutter and Marjorie Catter, Brian McDwin and Brian McQuinn. Those are names that would conflict. It takes a lot to get to the point where a name is going to conflict with another one. I can't ever remember finding a name conflict in the whole time. Well, I guess I found one actually, but literally only once in 20 years have I had a name that got bounced for conflict. There are also names that are, could be returned for presumption. So you can't register knight unless you're a knight. It depends though on whether on some cases, if you have a family name that was used by normal people, you can use it as a personal name. So the classic example would be Pope. Lots of people, for whatever reason in England, were given the surname Pope, and nobody thought that they were the Pope. So you can register, Francis Pope and pass it. I don't know if you could pass Alexander Pope. It'd be worth a shot. But Francis Pope would pass, even though Pope is a title. And depending on how you use it, it could be an issue. The example they give in the rules is, if you submit the name Regina the Laundress, you're clearly not claiming to be the queen of anything. If you submitted the name Regina of England, that would get returned. There are a few names that are used because they were only used by royal families. One of the classic examples is Hohenstaufen, which was really only used by the family that were the rulers of the Holy Roman Empire for a good long time. Stuart, on the other hand, was used all over the place. And even though there's a House of Stuart that was a royal family, there were a lot of Stuarts who weren't part of any royal family. Then anything that gives you the claim to be anything that makes it sound like you're claiming superhuman abilities, magical powers, or divine origin becomes an issue. This recently came up because there was a name, I believe it was that was it. It was a Norse name, and it was returned because it meant that the person was a sorceress who could talk to the dead. And the only use it had, the only time it was ever used was to mean someone who could talk to the dead. And so we dug and dug around, and we found another name that usually gets translated as witch, but meant more someone who could, more of an herbalist. And so they had very kind of similar things, but one meant this person does sorcery, and the other one was not quite as sorceress. And so the not quite as sorceress one, they were willing, was able to go through. One thing that's important to say is, in that rule, and this is how it stated in the rules, a name phrase used by normal human beings during our period is not considered to be a claim to superhuman abilities. So you can actually register Odinson because people were named Odin, like ordinary human beings were given the name, I guess kind of like Jesus, and so calling yourself Odinson doesn't mean that you're claiming to be Odin's son. It means you're claiming to be the son of a person named Odin. The final thing that can get a name, or not the final thing, but I guess it is a final thing. A name that's offensive will get returned. If a name refers, there are some really, really vulgar names, especially English. There are English by names that were used by normal people that were recorded in legal records that I won't say. And I'm not particularly puritanical when it comes to cussing, but there's some nasty stuff out there. Names that are offensive, even if they're period, either because they were offensive at the time, or and nobody, and the people who took them didn't care, or names that can be construed to be offensive now will get returned. That doesn't happen very often, but when it does, they get, it is important to catch those. So those aren't going to come up often, but since we have the time, it's worth talking about. Well, thank you very much.